When studying history, I've always been fascinated with what is omitted as much as I've been fascinated with what is spoken about. And when I think about the Cold War, I can't help but think that victory has defeated the West. Victory has defeated the United States of America. Because it was at the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the United States of America proclaimed that the Cold War had been won, that the battle over communism has been triumphant, as if everything just ended right there. And maybe it did, at least with the Soviet Union. But what didn't change was the at least 60, 70 years of Soviet communist infiltration into American institutions. And we could get into the details of that, and over the next few weeks I'm going to be talking a lot about the history of communist infiltration within the institutions of the United States of America. But sometimes it's easier to teach people to paint a picture by speaking in broad strokes. And if you just look at the modern world, there are tens of thousands of professors who self-identify as cultural Marxist. Now, Marxism is an ideology that has led to the deaths of more people in a short period of time, 100 years, than any ideology in the history of humanity. I mean, there's debate about the numbers, but let's call it 50 million in the Soviet Union. Let's call it another 50 million in China under Mao. There is no question that communism is a deadly ideology. Yet tens of thousands of professors self-identify as Marxists. Let's contrast that with something. Can you imagine the public outrage, the media coverage that there would be if a professor came out and self-identified as a fascist? All you would hear is hateful right-wing ideologue poisoning the minds of America's youth, poisoning the minds of the West. Yet there's complete silence over the tens of thousands of communist professors we see in higher education and communists riddled throughout all institutions of the United States of America. I mean, John Brennan was just the director of the CIA. He's admitted that during the Cold War, he was a communist. Can you imagine if, we'd have to be jumping back and forth through time here, but can you imagine if he admitted that he was a supporter of the Nazis during World War II and then he was the director of the CIA? It's absolutely outrageous, yet there is no outrage. And you see this in contradictions time and time again. Look at when Barack Obama ran for office. Hope and change was really hope and redistribution. And that was shown during the now famous, infamous Joe the Plumber situation, in which Obama basically said that he believes the fairest economy is one that redistributes wealth so that all people get a piece of the pie. A clear indication of socialist ideology. But of course, socialism involves the government takeover of the private sector. But Obama was campaigning on that the government was going to essentially take over the healthcare industry. Now, it might not be a literal takeover, but it's through extreme regulation. Well, if you have the ability to control everything that happens within an industry, then the government controls that industry. And with the passage of Obamacare, the government was able to effectively take over 1/6 of the American economy. And Obama's lawyers, after campaigning that it wasn't a tax, when we of course all knew that Obamacare was the biggest tax hike in American history. Well, Obama had his lawyer go in front of the Supreme Court after telling the public that no, it's not a tax. And his lawyer argued in front of the Supreme Court, yes, Obamacare is a tax. And the Supreme Court ruled that Congress has the ability to levy taxes, and because of that, they declared Obamacare constitutional. Constitutional, but built on a lie. Designed to give the government control of 1/6 of the American economy and implement a redistribution of wealth program of the likes of which the country hadn't seen maybe since the New Deal. So with all of this evidence, it is clear looking back that he could call himself what he wants, but Barack Obama is a socialist. This is evident in Obamacare, in the taking over of 1/6 of the economy. This is evident in the Obamacare and the redistribution of wealth. This is evident in bailouts, that the government taking over a large part of the auto industry. This is evident in the government seizing control over the student loan industry. This is all government takeover of the private sector and redistribution of wealth, which the student loans are as well. Call it what you want, but it's easy to identify that Barack Obama is a socialist based on the policies he put forward for 8 years. And this was evident at the time, but if you listen to the mainstream media, almost no one in the mainstream sounded the alarm. And then you see the mainstream media and their refusal to call out socialism, their refusal to be like academia, to be honest about the history and the bloodshed caused by socialism. And you realize that that institution as well has been infiltrated by socialists, because there is no denying that the mainstream media, the overwhelming preponderance of it, is overwhelmingly progressive. And of course, progressive, they promote the same policies as socialists. It's just rebranding because it's hard to defend an ideology, that has been proven a failure. But the ideology is not about redistribution. The ideology is about the obtaining of power. So you could see that academia, the mainstream media, have been infiltrated by socialism, by communism, by Marxism. Contrast that with President Trump. When President Trump ran for office, the mainstream media yelled at the top of their lungs. They kicked and screamed. It was on the cover of every newspaper, the cover of every website, the cover of every magazine, that Donald Trump was supported by members of the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and that he had to disavow these people. He had to disavow David Duke, and rightfully so. He should have had to disavow those types of people because they have a toxic ideology. Well, compare that with Obama. He was not forced to disavow socialist, communist Bill Ayers. He was not forced to disavow the communists, the socialist parties throughout the country, and guerrilla groups that supported his campaign because they understood that he was bringing America closer to their ultimate goal of a global neo-Marxist revolution. The media wouldn't even acknowledge that Obama had these socialistic tendencies, let alone putting public pressure on him to disavow the socialists that supported him. But President Trump received public pressure to disavow the right-wing, allegedly, the right-wing fascist white nationalists that supported him, and rightfully so. communist professors can act with impunity. They could come outright and say that they're Marxist. But imagine if there was a fascist professor. America declared that it had won the Cold War, but the remnants of the Cold War remained. John F. Kennedy warned us about this before we died when he talked about the global advancement of communism. He said that we face a monolithic global conspiracy that does not attack through traditional means, through warfare, but attacks through covert means, through subversion, through infiltration. He was trying to tell us that for many years, this ideology had been infiltrating, subverting American institutions. And even though the Soviet Union collapsed and the physical, so to speak, it's a contradiction, but the physical, you know what I'm talking about, the Cold War in terms of America funding one side of a war, the Soviet Union funding another side of the war in Vietnam, Korea, wherever it might be, even though that may have been over, nothing was done about at that point, 60 to 70 years of communist infiltration into American institutions. And we are seeing the remnants of that in American society today.